Assalamu alaikum, comrades. Today I came across this tweet from Today in History. Apparently today, the day that I'm filming this, December 27th, 1929, Soviet dictator Joseph #Stalin orders the liquidation of the kulaks, the peasants/independent #farmers. It's really interesting how they choose to say all of this, but it got me thinking. This topic is discussed a lot, especially in anti-communist spaces, and when talking about Soviet history as a whole in general, as one of the reasons to discredit the entire Soviet experiment. One of the most interesting things about studying history, to me, is the varied perspectives, accounts, and the justifications. Rarely does something happen without any sort of reason, or someone at least believing that they did something rightfully at the time. So how did the Soviets justify this? I'm going to tell you. So first, what is a kulak? I thought it would be fun to look at the Great Soviet Encyclopedia for their definition of what a kulak is. It's insightful. It tells you their exact definition through their eyes, their perspective, their way. So let's look at it. As you can see, this is the official translation of the 1979 version of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, and it says kulaks, the rural bourgeoisie who became rich through predatory exploitation, loan sharking, and speculation. The word was first applied to the bourgeoisie forming in the Russian countryside during the 1890s. This includes a whole history through the Soviet perspective, and it's quite interesting. For instance, what they choose to highlight, saying the kulaks offered bitter resistance to the kolkhoz movement. They even murdered party activists and organized anti-Soviet rebellions. This extreme exacerbation of the class struggle necessarily hastened the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. I found this particularly interesting. By 1941, there were about 930,000 former kulaks, about 220,000 families in places of settlement. During the Great Patriotic War, the majority of them worked selflessly. Their children fought at the front against the fascist German invaders. Many were awarded orders and medals. After the war, the last restrictions on kulaks were lifted. They regained the right to leave their place of settlement. Thus, the majority of former kulaks were drawn into socialist construction, re-education, and transformed into fully equal citizens of Soviet society. So yeah, that's how they basically explain it. Now let's look at that decree. Sometimes when you Google or just generally search this topic, a lot of the references that you find are from books or different academic perspectives, not the actual decree itself. So let's take a look at that. This decree is the quote, concerning questions of agrarian policy in the USSR, speech delivered at a conference of Marxist students of agrarian questions, December 27th, 1929. Now this is just a highlight for the parts where they actually mention the kulaks, because there's a big speech about different theories and even a bit about the specifics of how much grain they withheld for themselves or destroyed, but we're going to skip past that. This is the best place to start. The characteristic feature in the work of our party during the past year is that we, as a party, as the Soviet power, A, have developed an offensive along the whole front against the capitalist elements in the countryside. B, that this offensive, as you know, has brought about and is bringing about very palpable positive results. What does this mean? It means that we have passed from the policy of restricting and exploiting proclivities of the kulaks to the policy of eliminating the kulaks as a class. This means that we have made and are still making one of the decisive turns in our whole policy. Until recently, the party adhered to the policy of restricting the exploiting proclivities of the kulaks. Could we have undertaken such an offensive against the kulaks 5 years or 3 years ago? Could we then have counted the success in such an offensive? No, we could not. That would have been the most dangerous adventurism. At the time, we were not yet able to substitute for the capitalist production of the kulaks the socialist production of the collective farms, the state farms. But now we are able to carry on a determined offensive against the kulaks, to break their resistance, to eliminate them as a class and substitute for their output the output of the collective farms and state farms. Now the kulaks are being expropriated by the masses, who are putting solid collectivization into practice. Now, the expropriation of kulaks in the regions of solid collectivization is no longer just an administrative measure. Now, the expropriation of the kulaks is an integral part of the formation and development of the collective farms. Consequently, it is now ridiculous and foolish to discourse on the expropriation of kulaks. You do not lament the loss of the heir of one who has been beheaded. There is another question which seems no less ridiculous, whether the kulaks should be permitted to join the collective farms. Of course not, for they are sworn enemies of the collective farm movement. So these are the kinds of things being said. This will be linked down below so you can look yourself as well. Another decree that's usually brought up in this discussion is often coined as being top secret, so you can definitely look at this document today. Again, I thought it would be more interesting to search for it in Russian on Yandex just to see if it comes up, and it does. There's lots of discussion on this in the Russian language. So, on January 30th, 1930, the Communist Party Politburo resolution called on measures to be taken for the liquidation of kulak ownership in complete collectivization regions. And it does go into detail of what is to be done to different classes of kulaks. So again, how did the Soviets explain this, justify this? What did they have to say to those who asked? In the 1920s and 30s, there were many publications created in various languages to explain Soviet policies and create understanding between nations, as there was much misinformation afloat, and the Red Scare had already began. Many of these publications are in English, and some of them do tackle these topics, these very sensitive topics. And this pamphlet, Dictatorship and Democracy in the Soviet Union by Louise Strong, which I highly recommend you read. The entire PDF is available online for anyone to look at. In fact, the first topic after the introduction is the drive on the kulaks. So let me read it to you. Let us seize the sharpest horns of the bull at once, the exiling in recent years of perhaps 1 million kulaks, the better-to-do peasants who exploited hired labor, from their rural homes in European Russia and Ukraine to Siberia and the northern woods. Here is an action which caused in America wide comment. What was the process? How was it carried on? The usual assumption outside of the Soviet Union is that the exiling occurred through drastic action by a mystically omnipotent GPU. The actual process was quite different. It was done by village meetings of poor peasants and farmhands, which listed those kulaks who, quote, impede the collective farm by force and violence, and asked the government to deport them. In the hot days of 1930, I attended several of these meetings. They were harsh, ruthless discussions, analyzing one by one the best families which had grabbed the best lands, exploited labor by owning the tools of production, as best families normally and historically do, and who were now fighting the rise of the collective farms by arson, cattle killing, and murder. Meetings of poor peasants and farmhands discussed them, questioned them, passed on them, allowing some to remain, but listing others as dangerous to our peaceful development should be deported from the village. That's a quote right there. It was a harsh, bitter, and by no means bloodless conflict. I was reminded of it again in the San Joaquin Valley of California by the cotton pickers' strike in autumn of 1933. Louise Strong always does a great job at referencing current affairs at the time and comparing things to similar situations in the U.S. I think it's great to get people to understand instead of othering it. The same gradations from half-starved farmhand to wealthy rancher, though the extremes in California were wider. California local authorities permitted deportations of pickets who interfered with farming of private ranchers. Soviet authorities permitted deportation of kulaks who interfered with the collectively owned farms of poor peasants and laborers. In both cases, the central government sent investigating commissions, slightly moderating therewith sanctioned the local actions. The Governor's Commission in California threw out a few of the most untenable cases against strikers. In the USSR, the township and provincial commissions reviewed the list of kulaks for exile and greatly cut them down, guarding against local spites and excesses. But the active winning will, which could count on the backing of government, was in California the will of ranchers and finance corporations. In the USSR, the will of organized farmhands. That, in its simplest essence, is proletarian dictatorship. Then there's this pamphlet. What about Russia? An honest reply to honest questions, also by Louise Strong. She was behind a lot of these efforts to help bring understanding between the United States and the Soviet Union. There's some really interesting parts in here about the famine in Ukraine. The question being, is it true that during 1932 to 33, several million people were allowed to starve to death in Ukraine and the North Caucasus because they were politically hostile to the Soviets? And this response is quite remorseful. There's a quote directly in here from Stalin that says, "We communists are to blame for not foreseeing and preventing the difficulties." Well, let's look at the whole thing. So, in response to that question, she says, "Not true. I visited several places in those regions during that period. There was a serious grain shortage in the 1932 harvest, due chiefly to inefficiencies of the organizational period of the new large-scale mechanized farming among peasants unaccustomed to machines. To this was added sabotage by the dispossessed kulaks, the leaving of the farms by 11 million workers who went to new industries, the cumulative effect of the world crisis in depressing the value of Soviet farm exports, and a drought in 5 basic grain regions in 1931, so not just Ukraine. The harvest of 1932 was better than that of 1931, but was not at all gathered. On account of over-optimistic promises from rural districts, Moscow discovered the actual situation only in December, when a considerable amount of grain was under snow." Opposing the tendency of many communists to blame the peasants, Stalin said, as I mentioned before, "We communists are to blame for not foreseeing and preventing the difficulties." Several organizational measures were at once put into action to meet the immediate emergency and prevent its reoccurrence. Firm pressure on defaulting farms to make good the contracts they had made to sell 1/4 their crop to the state in return for machines the state had given them. The means of production contributed by the state was more than all the peasants' previous means. Was combined with appeals to loyal, efficient farms to increase their deliveries voluntarily. Saboteurs who destroyed grain or buried it in the earth were punished. The resulting grain reserves in state lands were rationed to bring the country through the shortage with a minimum loss of productive efficiency. The whole country went on a decreased diet, which affected most seriously those farms that had failed to harvest their grain. Even these, however, were given state food and seed loans for sowing. Simultaneously, a nationwide campaign was launched to organize the farms efficiently. 20,000 of the country's best experts in all fields were sent as permanent organizers to the rural districts. The campaign was fully successful and resulted in a 1933 grain crop nearly 10 million tons larger than was ever gathered from the same territory before. So, yeah, a pretty interesting and decent explanation. The next question is if there's a chance of another famine, and they kind of laugh at the question and say, no, it's not possible because we made all of these precautions. Unfortunately, these documents didn't always make it to the intended audiences. While the efforts were there to create understanding and at least provide the Soviet perspective, often the only people who would pick these things up and read them were those who were already sympathetic towards the Soviets. But these documents were there, and they're still there for us to look at today. And it's so important to understand that side of the discussion. So lastly, I want to leave you with a quote from the book, The Soviets Expected It. The very first page is incredibly powerful, and I personally am quite moved by the sentiment. Chapter 1, The Russians Are People. I never fell for this talk about the mystery of Russians. Russians are people, like Americans, like Chinese. People are very much alike and also very different. Whether you stress the likeness or the difference depends upon your aim. Hitler preaches a superior race of Germans. The American Declaration of Independence asserts that all men are created equal, while Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, proclaimed that we are all alike, sinners and sons of God. The Russians never wanted to be a mystery. When I first went to Moscow 20 years ago this autumn, they were explaining themselves in tomes of Marxist logic to all who would hear. Most people wouldn't. They called the explanations propaganda. When they were more polite, they called them dreams, as H.G. Wells did with Lenin's mad dream of electrification propounded in the dark night of civil war. After a while, the Russians stopped explaining. They let their actions speak. Now, this was written in the middle of World War II, the context for the last paragraph. Today, their actions shout to the world in battle. They shout from the world's front lines. In the hot flame of those actions, 1,000 myths about the Soviet land are shriveled. The myth of Russian backwardness, the myth of machine-like regimentation, the myth of discontented peasantry burning to overthrow the Stalin regime. When the ultimate test of war tried the European peoples, the chief difference that appeared was that the Soviet people showed a unity, efficiency, and courage beyond others, and a more spectacular resistance to Hitler than any other land. They set alight a hope, a confidence in final victory that seemed to have died from the continent of Europe. Well, comrades, what do you think about these selected, and of course biased, perspectives from the Soviets and those sympathetic towards them at the time? It's an important piece of the entire picture that is often forgotten in the English language and discussions today, especially on the internet. I hope you found it interesting or at least a little bit insightful, so please be inspired by history, and thank you for listening to me. All my links are down below, and I greatly appreciate you. Goodbye.